to all of you here on the African continent and around the world. This is Let's Talk About Health in Africa on Utano Podcast with me, Lenias Hwenda. Today on Utano Podcast, we are talking about an important issue, one that has led to the death of so many African children in the Gambia after taking cough medications made by an Indian company called Medines Pharmaceuticals that were contaminated with toxic chemicals. How did medications that had toxic contaminants reach the hands of patients? And what does that say about the state of quality and safety of the medicines that people are taking on the African continent? My next guest on Utano Podcast is Muller and Farai Masekela. Both are leaders in various efforts to make sure that medicines that Africans are taking are safe and of good quality. Wayne is a pharmaceutical expert who has worked at national, regional, and international levels with some of Africa's leading medicines regulatory institutions, including the National Medicines Regulator of South Africa, SAPRA. He has also performed international roles within the WHO, PICS, Zazi Bonner, and recently on the African Vaccine Manufacturing Project. Wayne's primary role is auditing manufacturing facilities where medicines are being produced both in South Africa, across the continent, and internationally, as well as training inspectors from various national medicines regulatory authorities on the continent and around the world. Farai works with the Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe as head of the Evaluation and Registration Division. In this role, he leads the teams of medicines assessors at the Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe. He is also the chairperson of the Evaluation of Medical Products Technical Committee in the Africa Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative under AUDA NEPAD. Today on Utano Podcast, both Wayne and Farai are speaking to us in their capacity as African experts in medicines regulation. They are not speaking on behalf of any of the organizations that they may be affiliated with. I asked them what went wrong in the Gambia, which led to so many African children dying from taking cough syrup that was contaminated with toxic chemicals. And why did the measures that should have prevented this from happening fail? And could it happen again? So let's get started. Wayne and Farai, it's my pleasure to have you on Utano Podcast today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm humbled by it when you hear somebody speak about you in a sense, and you think about all the things you're involved with and all of the inspections you've done, etc. So it does put things a bit in perspective as well. Kind of says to you, geez, to do all this, you need to be a bit older. So anyway, let me just start on the Gambia, as you asked about why did this occur? Will it happen again? What has been the history of this? Now, this is extremely unfortunate that has happened, and I use the word unfortunate in a very kind of pointed way, because it's not dismissive in terms of saying children has died, it's unfortunate, these things happen. That is not the context of the word. So obviously, if somebody takes this piece out of context, it might sound blasé, and it's certainly not. It has proven that this issue, and we'll explain a bit more about it, how it happened, can happen again. This has happened in 2022, not long ago. I can't say I was a young boy then, but it was happening in 2022. It was happening in 2023. Fortunately, we had some recalls of that, and we'll go through some of the practices that has been put in place. But this has been a scourge for the last 80 years. And when you hear something like thalidomide and the children that were maimed with that happening in the 1960s. And we do not see that occurring, that toxicity that it affects the unborn child, as an example, to the extent of thalidomide. Yet, for 80 years, we've been suffering the scourge of these cough syrups coming into different countries, Africa being one of them. And it kind of, if you look at the statistics, it's kind of the low income or the low to middle income countries, and this is where it has kind of manifested, and a lot of the deaths and injuries has occurred here.
Yes.
So if we go back to the Gambia, we had something like 70 unfortunate deaths due to a lack of various systems that has failed. And first and foremost, I recently we trained the members of the Chinese NRA, and in China they had a big issue with heparin, which occurred not too long ago. But part of the class work, if you will, or a class exercise, was that we asked them to look into the history of the cough syrup being contaminated. And one first time that people have heard about it, and I think that's part of the role in terms of that WHO is playing and should be playing a bigger role in terms of the awareness. So that's the first port of call, if you will. And this is now being provided to all the NRAs that can play a role in there. And I said it very bluntly during that training.
Yes.
That on the watch of the NRA in the countries, they, and I'm part of the NRA as well.
Yeah.
We failed. And we have to take this very, very personally and say, this has happened on our watch.
Yes.
So what is your role if you, the person to protect the patient, you failed? And people look at me very pointedly and say, Wayne, how can you say that we failed? It's a multidimensional problem. But the dimension in which the NRA functions, that function failed for whatever reason. And one, as I say, is awareness, which I think that we can speak about more about that later on.
Yes.
So what actually happened here? This was a medicine manufactured for children, and it is packaged. I won't say beautifully, but packaged very functionally. So it really there's child on the box. It's got the ingredients. Everything is there. But glycerine is utilized a lot in the manufacture of cough syrups, and glycerine is there to increase the miscibility. Maybe it's a technical word. It's the solubility of the other ingredients. Okay, so if you look at an ingredient that may be insoluble in water, which is also sometimes a base of cough syrup, but the active ingredient or the inactive ingredients, excipients, these do not dissolve in the water. So you have a solvent aid to then promote the dissolution of these excipients and APIs in the base of the cough syrup. And one of that excipients is glycerine. And glycerine is used quite extensively in cough syrups to aid the dissolution or the solution of these various excipients and active, mainly the actives. So glycerine is what we would call an inactive, right? It's there as a sweetener as well. So because some of the cough syrups taste bitter, and when you are giving children, when we have given medicine to children, you will see that sometimes children pull up their faces and all of that. So you try to make it very palatable and in terms of taste friendly.
Yes.
So so glycerine has got these many functions. And unfortunately, glycerine is one of those group of excipients which do not differ much from something called diethylene glycol. And diethylene glycol is a material, or is a excipient as well, that shouldn't be in medicine. And we'll go through how it gets there. But this diethylene glycol is actually used when you put what we call antifreeze in a car to prevent the water from boiling, essentially, and overheating your car. You put in this product called diethylene glycol. And it has many uses, as uses even as a paint stripper. None of these uses are medical related at all. So how does it come into the medicine? So what we have found, and various investigations have found, is that the diethylene glycol is a much cheaper alternative than glycerine, okay? So, and now people have adulterated the glycerine. So instead of you having 100 liters of glycerine, they put 50 liters of glycerine and 50 liters of diethylene glycol. And because it is an excipient, our vigilance with regard to excipients has been a bit lacking. We focused a lot on the APIs. Does it have chlorpheniramine? Does it have diphenhydramine? So that has been one of the areas as well. So we have not been able to put effective measures in place to pick up these contaminants in excipients. And this has been the issue here, is that here the excipient has been adulterated. So now the supplier has adulterated the excipient. It goes through various parts of the supply chain. The more complex the supply chain, the more areas where this excipient goes through, it gets handled. People can then adulterate it more.
Yes.
And by the time it comes to the manufacturer, who in this case was in India, a company called Medines Pharmaceutical, it is common knowledge, it's not a secret. This company then took this product. Now, the issue is, did they knowingly put it in the cough syrup? Did they unknowingly put it in cough syrup? Did they have procedures in place when they put it in? That is still, there's still a lawsuit going on. I think the latest one was November 2023. This has happened in the Gambia.
Yeah. Sure. Let me pull in Farai. So various systems failed, regulators failed, and there are things that were supposed to happen. And what you're unpacking here, Wayne, is a very complex supply chain of raw materials, of ingredients, and all of the things that it takes to make a medicine. Regardless of whether the substitution with diethylene glycol, which is cheaper in place of glycerine, was done knowing that this could be harmful, but people used it anyway. Regardless, there should have been systems and mechanisms in place to make sure that that was detected and that those medicines never should have ended up in the hands of children, in the hands of patients. Farai, help us understand how the various institutions or the systems that should have been in place, that if had they worked well together, we would not have had that issue arising. Somebody would have picked it up either in the factory, either at the border, when the product is being exported, or when it's being received in the country. Help us understand how these institutions are supposed to work together to mitigate this sort of thing and keep African patients safe.
Thank you very much, Lenias, and thank you for having me as well on the podcast together with Wayne. I think it's an interesting discussion, one which brings a lot of value, I think, to the African continent as well as, I think, globally. So I think from what Wayne was describing, you can tell that the systems that we have are general on the continent. This is quite well documented, are generally weak in terms of the regulatory systems for medicines. So again, if you look at the WHO global benchmarking tool, which I think WHO is going around, countries are even doing self-assessment to see how strong their systems are. And the minimum they say should be, the ideal is maturity level 3, which is a system that can actually control medicines on its market effectively. So in this particular case, the systems which failed, I think, start all the way from the manufacturing facility all the way to the market. And what you will note is it is the responsibility of each and every country or each and every national medicines regulatory authority to ensure that the products on the market that are available to its population are safe, effective, and of good quality. So regardless of what comes from the factory, I think the responsibility then ultimately lies with the regulatory authority to make sure that what is available on the market is safe. In this particular case, if you look at the WHO benchmarking, you are looking at things like the marketing authorization, like Wayne was discussing earlier, where the excipients actually, in this particular case, which is the non-active ingredients, were they assessed effectively or not. From a good manufacturing perspective, where this facility actually inspected to a satisfactory level by the regulator concerned. Those are the questions that we then begin to raise. Then in terms of market control and surveillance, was this sufficient? Because are there other products on the same market or even on the larger African market which are substandard, falsified, and it's documented that it's a lot of products. So what you will note that it's a systemic issue across the continent, and as a result, we have a burden to make sure that we build systems on the continent. So these systems could be systems that are related to making sure that the products that we approve and put on the market are actually of good quality. And this starts all the way from making sure that the facilities that the manufacturing sites where these products come from are actually inspected by the inspectors and ensuring that they're actually certified and of a sufficiently high standard for them to produce products that we are supposed to accept on the continent. Again, you will note that if there is a lack of control that we have maybe in some markets on the continent, those will likely be affected more because then there's a tendency to then dump products on those markets where control is not as effective compared to the other markets where control is effective. Then you also mentioned something like import-export. So at the point of entry, I know there are a number of countries that actually do testing of products that come, analysis, lab analysis. Then there are a number of products that do not do any lab analysis. So is it something to think about then to say, should all the products that come onto our markets be analyzed at the point of entry? Probably something to consider so that we, and this could start particularly if resources are not permitting with a risk-based approach, where we would say things like these cough mixtures that with the extensive debate that the extensive explanation that Wayne was giving, where if there's products that are known to be at high risk of adulteration or being contaminated, like these cough mixtures for children, should those not be targeted for analysis, laboratory analysis, before they are actually put on the market? These are things to consider in terms of import-export control. Then in terms of also building systems, there are lots of regulatory system strengthening initiatives on the continent. Again, it's then getting all these together to make sure that on the continent, we are at a sufficiently high level to be able to control medicines. And this also goes to the discussion of the African Medicines Agency, as well as the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative, the MRH, to try and make sure that we, wherever possible, let's work together on the continent and control the products to ensure that whatever is then going to be put on the markets in the different 54, 55 African countries is actually of sufficiently good quality. I think those are my initial thoughts for now. Thank you very much, Lenias.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And when we come back, where is the African continent getting most of its medicines from? And if African countries are to rely on other regulatory authorities, what does a fit-for-purpose reliance framework look like for the African continent? Thank you, Farai. So many levels there where there are failures, and you talk about risk-based approach, Wayne, the risk-based approach. You mentioned earlier that in this case, or in many cases, in fact, there aren't systems for detecting and evaluating the ingredients that are being put into the medicines in the first place. Now, that occurs to me to be a big problem, because if you have that happening upstream, how do you assess risk in terms of your medicines? Yes, we know the medicine, the syrups are obviously very vulnerable to this, but if we don't really know, if we don't have a system for controlling the quality of ingredients that are going in the first place for everything, how do you assess the risk? Which products you should be looking at more if substitution is likely to be happening across the board? And can you just explain how you came to be actually training the regulators in the Chinese medicines regulatory authority? Is that related to the idea that perhaps the regulators with oversight, who are overseeing production, are missing some of these things and need to also come up to speed in terms of having systems for detecting and making sure they know that the ingredients being used in the first place are of good quality?
Yes, so I'm part of the what the WHO terms regulatory strengthening. So with regulatory strengthening, it's not just, it goes to various countries and various NRAs. As an example, it will go to Tanzania, to Egypt. And it was at SAPRA, which was last year, earlier last year. So it goes to various regulatory agencies, but we find that lots of countries are asking for this regulatory strengthening. In this case, for instance, the Chinese authority, we were training on classification of deficiencies, as an example, and also the risk-based approach to inspections in general, because you cannot cover everything. And Farai pointed out an important part was this manufacturer indeed audited? In South Africa, we did not deal with that company. So as the first port of call, that was kind of a sense of relief in one way. The other part is that when NRAs do go out to assess, to audit, inspect companies, there isn't enough awareness that we should be, if the company is manufacturing cough syrups using glycerine, there could be contamination with diethylene glycol or ethylene glycol. And is there sufficient knowledge within the inspectorates to be able to do this effectively? So what I'm doing is maybe a bit of a crusade in a sense with WHO vehicle, is I'm making people aware that these things are happening. And also we need to be training inspectors about what is it that you need to look for. As I said, because in terms of risk-based, you kind of focus on the active ingredients, and the excipients you have less. We would say, this is less risky. We must ensure that it's enough active, the potency is effective, and also the amount that we put in to the product is very much controlled. When it comes to the adulteration of these, there is not effective measures that the NRA has mandated doing this, because look, it's not that these excipients don't come to the NRA. As Farai said, it would be in their role. But what is the expectation about when a dossier comes into the NRA and we see there is a glycerine in there? Do we look at, or do we insist that they should have the impurity profile of the glycerine and as an example, which is the excipient, and not just focusing on the higher risk, which we think is the higher risk material in terms of the active, when indeed the glycerine is the highest risk? So I think there needs to be an education, part of training, part of awareness, that one, these occur, and two, what is our expectation on these companies and who has submitted a dossier, whether it be the applicant or the company? What do we as an NRA have to look for? And more importantly, because a dossier is just a bunch of documents, it is the real thing that's happening on the site that you want to see, compare that to the dossier. So back to Farai's point, were these companies indeed audited? Maybe they were. Did they get a clean bill of health? Probably. But did we audit this in the right way? And that is where we need to increase our efforts and our training efforts, particularly with the inspector, because this is an example. It is a serious example that is happening, but other things can take its place or be in addition. So we have to be aware of what this is. And as you know now, I know this talk is about this issue in one way, but if you look at the more complex products, the vaccines, complex proteins, etc., there are also risks that can occur, and it's that has to be also taken into account.
Yeah. So do we insist on the impurity profile? And what I'm hearing from you, Wayne, is that the way that regulators have been looking at this in terms of what to focus on, the focus on the active and not so much on the excipients and other ingredients that may be contained in a medicine. Perhaps the balance of that needs to change in terms of where the emphasis is, in order not to overlook some other important elements that regulators must insist on when they are evaluating those dossiers. Now, I had a conversation with Patrick Tipu, the Chief Scientific Officer of BioVac, and he said that there is an accepted paradigm that medicines that are made in Africa are basically equal bad quality. But what I'm wondering is there an opposite paradigm that equates medicines that are made outside of Africa, medicines that are made in India, as being of equal, of good quality? Just automatically, if it's coming from there, it's better. If it's coming from here, it's not so good, which allows perhaps those products to be subjected to less scrutiny and creating situations like this that create harm. Can you just share your reflections on the balance of those issues, how we look at it, and whether there is less scrutiny based on our ideas of who makes good quality medicines and who doesn't?
Yeah, I think the way we need to think about this is that, and I've always tried to to look at the world is a small world, especially in the regulated world, in that you can inspect a facility and in 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, they can be inspected by the MHRA, they can be inspected by FDA, DGA, etc. So we need to, in terms of the inspectorates that are on the African continent, this is where to give an example, in terms of the thirst for knowledge, put it that way, and for training. When we conducted our first training session on the African continent with regard to vaccine manufacture, there were more than 300 attendees. So it shows us that the training aspect with the inspectorates is at a point where, yes, Farai has pointed to the maturity levels from WHO, whether you are 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, etc. And a lot of these countries on the African continent, I think there's only 3, 4 countries, and Farai can maybe add to it, that is at maturity level 3 on the African continent, right? If you look at a membership of PICS as an example, there's only 1 country with 2 countries. I think Egypt has now acceded to PICS membership, and Tanzania, I think, has also made some application in terms of pushing that through. So Farai is talking about 55 NRAs, right? Yeah. We only have, how many of these 55 are sitting at maturity level 3, which is a kind of a global benchmark, or is a global benchmark. And compare that to Europe. If you look at the European Medicines Agency, look at the amount of countries and the NRAs that are at the required maturity level, at least as a base 3. So if you look at India, a lot of our medicines come from India, China, not exclusively, but percentage-wise. A lot of the APIs are coming, and excipients come from China and from India as well, majority China. So if you look at India, India is not a member of PICS. The NRAs, we are working with the NRAs this year in terms of regulatory strengthenings or system strengthening from the WHO perspective. India is also have been included. I don't know in terms of the progression, you know, did they have, I only recently joined that group. But definitely, as an example, India's on, if you look at China's on. So you can see this is where the majority of medicines are coming from. This is where the majority of active ingredients are coming from. This is where the majority of the excipients are coming from. Thus, from a perspective of looking at where our biggest issues lie or potential, we don't go in there and say, hey, this is where the biggest problem lies. No, we realize that lots of these medicines are coming there, and that's where we must, from a risk profile, is to say, let's put our energies into not forget the African continent. No, it's just that there's a finite resource, and we have to spread it out. So from WHO perspective, there is a concerted effort to train NRAs in China, train NRAs in India, and not to say exclusively, but this is where the problem can occur, because most of the medicines are coming from there. Yes. And then if you look at the WHO pre-qualification program, that as well, where we have also differences with, for instance, when WHO goes to India and we then say we're going to inspect a facility, pre-qualification, we also pull in the regulatory agency from the country in where we are doing the inspection. Now, the NRAs, some do, some don't. We need to be quite firm that when we are going into a specific country, we need to pull in the NRA representative of that country as well, so that we can impart and what's important to us. And I think that is a valuable lesson that all NRAs on the African continent needs to be aware of, that when we do go and inspect, we need to pull in the NRA. The other issue is that, are there differences in quality? Are there differences if it's in Africa, we make a less of a quality product than in India or China? That certainly is not the case, not in my experience. If you look at, you for instance are inspecting on the continent or internationally or locally, as it were. We always need to remember, and this is a fundamental, that we are also training the African NRAs, especially the inspectorate. The fundamental is that what we do, as a famous film said, echoes into eternity. And it's true, because other regulated agencies come in, FDA come in, and now, for instance, SAPRA has inspected, the FDA finds a host of problems, and they think to themselves, wow, there was the NRA inspected, and yet we come in and we find a total difference of the parameters in terms of performance and compliance issues. So I think the standardization, we will talk a bit about reliance, all of these things add to, and this is where what Farai's talked about, maturity level. We are trying to get everybody to at least a maturity level 3, so that there is an harmonization, if you will, of systems. Now, the continent varies with regard to the amount of people. Some have a very small NRA, some have no NRA. The way it functions is different. So I think there's the first and foremost is to look at the way that we approach, whether it be wherever it is, but we need to have this harmonization in a way that whether FDA, TGA, EMA, whoever goes into a facility, we as an NRA on the continent, and it could be our facilities here on the continent, or it can be international, has to have the awareness that what we do is going to affect and impact what the next regulatory agency comes in to be doing. So our efforts, for instance, now, as I've told, just give an example, we had more than 300 attendees on our last training session. We are rolling that out this year in all quarters. And this is an attempt so that we can impart a same message to every NRA, that there's not the fragmented approach. And that is where this kind of perception on quality differences occur. It's because of the fragmented approach of the inspections. And thus, there's this way of saying, I call them the big five, like FDA, TGA, MHRA, EMA, etc., that these guys, because they work together in a much better way. If you look at EMA as an example, the European Medicines Agency, they work together in a much better way. There's much more reliance, there's much more trust, if you will, between the different organizations. We don't have that. Yes, the African Medicines Agency is going to alleviate that to a big extent, and AMRA is going to lead into that, but we are not there yet. But quality, well, what we do is comparable. It is really the standards that is applied to these various, from the various NRAs to the companies.
Right. Let me bring in Farai. So there is no standardization, and of course it was mentioned earlier that there are no effective measures that an NRA can mandate that is going to prevent adulteration. Now, from your perspective, you're assessing these things that are landing on your desk, and from the people who are making medicines. basically, how are you looking at least minimizing as much as possible the risk, bearing in mind you only have so much control from where you're sitting, and ultimately what is needed is a common way of looking at these challenges that is aligned between perhaps yourselves as receiving NRAs, regulators, and how you work with regulators in those countries where the medicines are coming from, which from what Wayne is saying are really also in need of significant training to raise their awareness of the magnitude of these problems that we are facing in African countries as recipients of those medicines.
Okay, thank you very much, Lenias. So I think the first part maybe to start is maybe to address a bit of what Wayne was saying in the previous question, which can then lead into what you've just asked in terms of how we then work together with even regulators from the countries where the products are coming from. So the first part, I think, to just add to what Wayne was saying is that I think statistically it shows that from at least 70% to as much as 90% of the products on the continent, depending on the source that you get the information from, are actually imported. So, and the bulk of that is imported from Asia, like what Wayne was saying. So when we then get incidences of products being substandard, they are more likely to come from those imports, because that's the majority of what we are using on the continent.
Yes.
And again, one of the things that we are trying to do as a continent is I'm sure you are familiar with the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa. There are lots of initiatives to try and make sure that we, as much as possible, manufacture products on the continent, so that we are also in control of some of these things. And as Wayne keeps mentioning the issue of auditing, it's much easier to audit a facility which is on your doorstep compared to maybe going somewhere else. So those are some of the issues that this Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa is trying to resolve, and also improve that manufacturing capacity. For vaccines, it's even worse. I think it's almost 99% of vaccines on the continent are imported. Again, there are those vaccine producing countries that are working on building facilities and trying to produce that, so that we also get some of the manufacturing on our shores, so that it's also easier to control. I think that way. I think so that hopefully that should then also assist with some of these issues that we're discussing. Then in terms of where the products come from and how we work with those regulators, what you will note is for most countries on the continent, we align with what the WHO has. So the WHO has a list of countries that they are calling currently, they're still called stringent regulatory authorities, but this term is transitioning to something that will be called WHO listed authorities. I think this is again related to the process of the global benchmarking tool that WHO is currently undertaking. So there are a list of countries that WHO recommends that you can rely on. I think this also brings into discussion the issue of reliance. Wayne touched a bit on that. So for the countries that are listed by WHO, they have a list of these on their website that we can rely on. It's easier for us to then say, okay, this product has been accepted in country A that WHO says you can rely on. These are the minimum things that they should submit to us, and we can again then do a risk assessment. So this applies to both assessments and inspections. Okay, so the first part is having a country that you can rely on. Then you have countries that are not listed, but still are supplying products to our borders, to our countries, to our markets. These are the products that we then focus our resources on in terms of doing full assessment, as well as full GMP inspection, which is the audits that Wayne is talking about. So trying to then balance those resources, like I think Wayne mentioned that resources are finite. We cannot have all the resources that we want. So that's the focus that we do. So we have products that are I think Wayne mentioned the issue of PICS countries, ICH countries. All these it's a list of countries that WHO recommends. So we base on that. Then the countries that are not listed, again, this is where we then focus all our resources on, ensure that we try to control that as much as possible. But what you will still note is that there is a lot of things that may be different. So for instance, I think that's one of the things that this conversation can bring up. You will find that there are some products that may be approved in a country that is regarded as stringent, but when it comes to Africa or to our countries, there are certain changes that are made. So, for example, way it's manufactured is changed. I think we've been discussing excipients here, the non-active ingredients. Some of it may be the grade has changed. Certain things that may be different. And this is where we then have to have a reliance framework that allows us to pick these things, which may be different, without necessarily having to redo all the work, because we do not have the resources to be able to do all that without stretching ourselves too thin. Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And when we come back, what is the most important thing that we need to institute on the African continent to make sure that a case like the Gambia never happens again? Great. So reliance. So you talked about reliance, Farai, and that sometimes there are some changes. So in fact, what you're looking at is not identical, because there are some small changes that you may not pick up in what you're supposed to be relying on. Wayne, elaborate a little bit more then on the advantages and disadvantages of reliance, because clearly it's not something that is working 100% to keep patients safe. If there are little tweaks that can happen, that can lead you to miss certain important things that could end up compromising patient safety.
Yeah, so if you look at reliance, and everybody within the regulatory sphere is talking reliance, and it really is a fantastic program in a sense, and I call it a program because it's basically gives the regulator a level of comfort that, as Bryce pointed out, the strict regulatory authority has gone and inspected, and you can then rely on that regulatory authority that has been that has now inspected that facility, and then it because companies get inspected by every body, and that in itself is problematic for the company. Maybe for the country it's good, but now you then can have this function of reliance, and you will approach a company, and you will say, which countries can you give us a regulatory history, your recent regulatory history. They then will tell you, I've been inspected by DGA, EMA, FDA, MHRA, as an example. And then you would get either the report, or you would get their certificate, etc. And you would do basically like a desk review. And so the process of you getting product into your market certainly is faster. The process that you rely on another regulatory agency, and now that negates you from having to go and do an inspection yourself, and that itself takes a long time in terms of logistics, in terms of the reports, all of those things. So there are many benefits of the reliance. And so mainly it's about safety, quality, and efficacy of medicine. So you can see, this is a strict regulatory authority. They have audited their compliance certificate is still within date. So I can apply this, and I can safely register this, or I can get this medicine into the country under, as an example, various mechanisms. In Sapra's case, they use Section 21 as an example. So, so those are the advantages. And when we call strict regulatory authorities, there's also some debate. How does one become a strict regulatory authority? Okay, what is a strict regulatory authority? Because a lot of countries, NRAs, are part of PICs. So what separates them out? So there's a bit of debate on that. But be that as it may, So you get those products into your country.
Mm.
Now the issue is, and part of this problem is that, for instance, now if the Gambia product, the cough syrup, this was made in India, made in pharmaceutical. Did they, for instance, were they inspected by a regulatory authority? I don't know. But let's just assume for the sake of this they were. So the NRA would say, FDA went to inspect them, so everything must be in order. We must be quite circumspect of this, because the NRA that went there maybe didn't look specifically at your concern.
Yeah.
And that's the issue. The next one is that because you have this complete reliance on reliance,
Yeah.
you then do not have the expertise to go yourself when you finally get there to do this. So if you look at, for instance, on the continent,
yes.
So we're now busy with the vaccine project. You'll find that only a few NRAs have got the necessary skills to go and audit a vaccine facility. Many others, because they were on reliance, FDA went there. I'm not using FDA as a scapegoat here or whatever. I'm just using an example.
Yes.
Or maybe I must use TJ. TJ went there, and thus we get a certificate. Vaccines are fine. Great. Bring it into the country. Give it to our babies, etc. Our patients, and they will be vaccinated. So now it comes, hey, do you have the skills? And we have 55 NRAs on the continent. Do we have the skills to go and audit? No, they don't, because the reliance has been happening all the time. So the skill set has diminished, or it was never even there. And thus now you have to build that skill set to be able to do. So now it's exactly that. The vaccine tells us a certain already why something like the Gambian issue could occur, because of different NRAs approaching this in a different way, because there's not a standardized way to look at it.
Yes, that's a very interesting point. What I'm hearing from you is that we have to think about or practice reliance in a way that does not diminish our ability to still perform the tasks that we need to perform to make sure Africans are safe. And you mentioned a very interesting point that African nations may have very particular, or a nation that is using reliance may have very particular concerns that the regulator that you rely on may not necessarily consider an issue. And and it occurs to me, with Africa accounting for 42% of substandard falsified medications that are circulating globally. 42%, that's a lot. It seems that we have a very unique situation that may not necessarily mimic many other countries in terms of the scale and magnitude of the challenge that's facing us. So Farai, with that in mind, that we must have much bigger concerns than anyone else facing substandard falsified medications around the world. Will African countries need to define a reliance framework that speaks to those particularities, that is fit for purpose based on our particular risk profile as African countries, with the kind of challenges that Wayne just pointed out, that regular auditors in a country that is relying on another may not have the skills to go and check things for themselves. Talk to me about your thinking around that. What would that have to look like? Who needs to define this, and what must it achieve in order for it to be fit for purpose and actually protect African patients?
Thank you, Lenias. So what you will find with reliance is, again, some of the principles of reliance are that reliance does not take away the sovereignty of a country. So ultimately, whether you use reliance or you do full review, full audit, the responsibility of the quality of a product on the particular market is the sole responsibilities for the NRA, okay, even though you may use Reliance. Then the other thing to note is that Reliance also has to be fit for purpose. Like you rightly say, it's not one size fits all. And the issues that Wayne raises show them, these are some of the aspects that have to be part of our Reliance framework that we develop on our own as Africans. Again, taking into consideration all the principles, the global principles of Reliance, which are well specified. I think in literature, you'll find a lot of information on Reliance. But the particular issues of concern, like Wayne is mentioning, sometimes there are these changes that I mentioned earlier that may occur in products that are coming to the continent versus those that are approved elsewhere on where we're relying on. And our framework should then ideally then be able to pick these things up specifically. So there are certain things, like for instance, if we're going to look at, for instance, one reliance mechanism might say you do not need to audit the facility. But another reliance mechanism might say, yes, you do not need to do a physical audit, but you can do a desk review. That's one level. Another reliance mechanism might be so full recognition. So we say a product registered in country A, country B will say we do not need to do anything. If it's registered there, then it's you can bring it directly onto our market. But another reliance mechanism may then say, if you register in country A, we still need to come and see the manufacturing site, but we're not going to do a dossier assessment. So that's another tier. So there are different tiers of reliance that you can then use and apply depending on the situation. And in our context, in the African context, there are definitely certain things that we still need to verify. The issue of these excipients, are the grades of excipients still the same? Is the manufacturing block or unit? This is what Wayne and team would check. Is it the same as the product that is coming? Is it the same manufacturing facility? So these things are things that will come into our reliance framework that we as Africans can customize and make it fit for purpose. So so there's actually work going on around that to try and customize a reliance framework for Africa. And once this is done, this will then be brought to the broader audience for comments and making sure that it's actually fit for purpose and can actually lead to protection of the population. Because ultimately, what we're trying to have is an NRA which puts products on its market should be confident that whatever mechanism it uses, whether full review, and full review also then relates to what Wayne was mentioning, the issue of capacity building. We need to have a lot of capacity building efforts on the continent still, because you will note that there's a lot of staff turnover within the regulatory authorities. So that also brings into perspective the issue that capacity building still has to be done. Then when you go to reliance, reliance is not like a lesser form of regulation. Reliance actually can only be practiced by people who know what they're doing, people who have the capacity to actually understand what full assessment is. Those are the people who can also do reliance effectively. Because if we look at it from the perspective that reliance is only done by people who are not, who do not have the competencies and the skills, we then miss it. Reliance is actually applied by people who know what they should look for, even when they're doing full review.
So Wayne, who should be defining the reliance framework that we need to be using in our African context that speaks to our own challenge, the specific challenges that we face? Where does it start? Because you have all these organizations, the WHO and all these other international mechanisms that exist that are setting this standard. But it occurs to me that we've had these mechanisms existing, and yet, the challenges that we face and all of these loopholes and deviations that you are all talking to today have existed and haven't been addressed. So does African nations, the African Medicines Agency, need to start by defining an African reliance mechanism that draws on the different mechanisms that exist that Farai points out to, which may not always be suited for the specific situations of every NRA that is trying to protect African patients on the continent?
Yeah, I think there may not be a standardized approach to reliance. That's certainly I would agree with Farai there. The issue is about how do we get the standardized approach? How does everyone on the African continent seems to be applying it in a different way? Some do, not everyone, but different countries apply it in different ways. Part of the African Medicine Agency is to look at the harmonization of the processes like reliance, so that there is an approach, not just reliance on the international regulated agencies, but the reliance within the regulated agencies on the continent. So it's as an example, if we have a group which may comprise of 3 different NRAs, and we go and inspect based on what we receive from EMPTC, we're talking vaccines, and this can apply to any product as well, okay?
Yes.
It's not just vaccine, and Farai can also talk to that. We then go out and we will inspect. Now, Egypt, as an example, was not part of that part of that inspection. So how do they internalize that inspection? There has to be a common reliance method which needs to be developed, and a framework needs to be developed on the African continent. And I know in terms of EMPTC, that's part of their process. So a dossier comes in from wherever country, a group of African continental inspectors go and inspect. You cannot take 55 countries there. It will be maybe four different countries as an example. Then there's all of these other 55, the rest of them, of the countries. How do they internalize that into and rely on that? So there's an internal reliance, and there's an external reliance, which we are not speaking of these other strict regulatory agencies who go and inspect. So I think this is part of our training that we are rolling out in terms of one of the EMPTC, which Farai is from, the chair, and the GMPTC, because they have to work together so that we do create the common framework used across the continent for reliance.
Yeah, so your 2 committees, the inspections and the GMP inspections team that you are both leading, are in fact leading in terms of thinking about how the African reliance framework should look like.
Yes, because, and Farai can add a few more onto that, because certainly in terms of the reliance as a process, or how this will then be internalized by the various countries, that I don't know, and Farai can maybe add how far that is down the track, because for me it's fine to go and inspect everything else, and we're focusing on the inspection methodology, what it is that one has to look at, and writing the report, getting the responses, all of that, and certifying the site is GMP compliant. Now, what happens from there? How will Nigeria, who wasn't part of that initial inspection, how will they internalize that so that we will be able then to say, yes, we are happy to rely on these other agencies. And a lot in Africa, Farai pointed out about the maturity level. There's a lot of inter-NRA collaboration at the moment. Yes. One country that has achieved ML3 4 is collaborating with another country, how to actually get to a certain level. So I think that's part of our thing. If we can get more and more countries onto the maturity level 3 as a base, that is what will really aid, because reliance will be part as well of that that maturity level, but certainly within AMA and within AMRA, with our TCs, GMP and EMP, we also need to establish the framework.
Yes, no, that's very interesting. Now, Farai, you mentioned, like you brought this up actually. The reliance is as how you use it to how you exclude countries that you should focus on. So you have the ones that are listed by the WHO as authorities that you can rely on, and then anything else outside of that is where you want to concentrate your resources to do full reviews to make sure that your bases are covered in terms of protecting patient safety. Do you have any reflections on how the reliance, the internal reliance, the kind of issues it needs to speak to? The CEO of SAPRA said that, you know, we need to practice reliance, but starting by relying on our own, the best amongst us. So just talk to us about, you know, the issues that our internal reliance mechanism should be addressing, and the tension, of course, that exists between whether African countries should be relying on one another versus, you know, relying on only the authorities that are recommended by international mechanisms, for instance.
No, perfect. Thank you very much, Lenias. So, yes, in terms of reliance amongst the African countries, this is definitely the stage that we've created, I think, together by working together on platforms like the RECs, the Regional Economic Communities. So within the Zanzibar collaboration, the East African Community, the ECOWAS in West Africa. So these platforms have actually exposed the different countries to what their compatriots are doing. So this has created a platform where we actually understand what, for instance, I'm from Zimbabwe, I understand what South Africa is doing, SAPRA, so I can then rely on. And recently, I think Zimbabwe and South Africa then signed a memorandum of understanding. So such mechanisms are going to happen in Africa more and more often. And you'll find that there are already countries that already had agreements on the continent, a number of countries actually, for relying on each other. And the way this works is such that if we can rely on each other, because we work together more often through the Zanzibar collaboration, through the economic communities in East and West Africa, we can actually build a more customized framework. And again, because we've already worked together on certain things, we actually understand what needs to be done for a framework to actually work. So what we have done as a continent is we've moved on to try and actually come up with a reliance framework that is fit for purpose. And this is work that is ongoing. And it would address all these things like internal reliance, because again, these are topical issues which, because we're working together on so many things, why should we duplicate what our neighbors have done when we know the quality of work that they can do? So for instance, if we've gone together for maybe 10, 15 audits, if we've assessed maybe 30, 40 products together, and we know the quality of work that they produce, why should we then not rely on what they do on their own? And again, this will only work, again, like I keep mentioning, when we have the same capacities in terms of, we know that the capacity in this particular country is such that they can do this work, and we can then rely on them. The other thing that will make it work is transparency. So for instance, if we say we want to rely on inspection that has been done by another country, can they share their inspection report? An assessment, can they share their assessment report? Where they cannot share their assessment report, what is the minimum that is required for a reliance framework to work? So those are things that we'll then have to define on our own to make a reliance in a reliance framework work. But ultimately, what you will notice, intra-African reliance, inter-country reliance within the African context is very, very important, and will be a very big part of us helping to assure that medicines across the continent are of good quality, are safe, effective, and of good quality. Thank you.
Great. And finally, to conclude, Wayne, what is the one most important thing that you think we need to institute on the continent to make sure that cases like the Gambia never, ever happen again?
Yeah, it's the harmonization process towards auditing to understand what can go wrong, create the awareness, because often we work in a vacuum. We think that in terms of auditing, there are different approaches to auditing. We need to standardize, and we need to incorporate these issues like the Gambia problem within our audit methodology, so it is standardized. And that's the approach that we are using as an example with the vaccine manufacturing project, but it goes across all different types of projects because different products. We're not just focusing on vaccines, although it's a big part of it, but now is the effort that you can see that for instance, our first training session, we had more than 300 people interact with us. So there's a standard way in which we have then communicated in terms of saying this is how, when you are auditing a facility, as an example, for incoming raw materials, this is the way that this needs to be done. If you are auditing utilities, compressed air, HVAC, water systems, this is what you need to be doing. So there is the start of an harmonization in terms of the audit methodology.
Hwenda and Farai, thank you so much for coming on to Utano Podcast today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.